Dan, as you know, has been our congressman for 6 years now, starting in 2004. He knows our state well. He grew up in Southern California and went away to college and came back. And for 8 years, from the years of 1990 to 1998, he served as our state's adjutant general and helped author the Three Strikes Law and Mason's Law. One of the standout qualities that I see in Dan, and I hope that you share this, is his accessibility. He has a good staff. He has staff nearby. He has a website. He sends out mailers. He asks for our opinions. He visits his districts. And he holds these wonderful town hall meetings. And I'm particularly impressed that he would come to the very edge of his district, which encompasses Alpine County. And we have a representative of Alpine County, maybe several of you here today, as well as Calaveras County. And he includes all the way into Sacramento area. So we're at the very outskirts, and yet he comes here, and here we have a whole array of people to listen to what he has to say and to be able to ask him questions and to meet him personally. I'd like to now introduce our congressman, and I'd like to have you all please welcome Dan Youngman.
Thank you and the other local officials for your service on the ground here close to the people. And I know we have a number of other elected representatives who are here. The Supervisor Russ Thomas, Supervisor Gary Palpinelli. Back there. Oh, they're all back there. Let's see, we've got Supervisor Marita Calloway. And let's see, Supervisor Terry Woodrow from Alpine County as well. So thank you for all being here. Before we start and before I introduce my staff, I'd like to make a little presentation here. One of the things that is absolutely true is in these difficult economic times, there are people who are hurting more than in better times. And we have certain organizations that assist in meeting the needs of those in our communities who need assistance. And one of those organizations in this area that does a great job is the Resource Connection. And I've had the opportunity to tour their food bank, look at the great work that Ian and Hayward does with their organization. Their staff has done just an outstanding job. And so I had the chance, even though last week we were snowed in D.C., we had one pro forma day by which we could enter something into the record. And so I entered something into the congressional record of the House of Representatives, which is a tribute to the Resource Connection and the people of Calaveras County. And it just briefly describes the great work that has been done there. It makes reference to a $1.36 billion community facilities loan from the United States Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, and the great new facility that you have. And when I visited last time, I was surprised at how really nice it is. And there's plenty of room there for plenty of activity, plenty of room there for plenty of food, and it looks like you have room for expansion as well within there. So if Ms. Hayward would come forward, I'd like to be able to do that. And also the former probation department head, who is now working very closely with the Resource Connection. So this is just a small token of recognition for what you are doing, and we know that you're helping many, many people in these communities that we have we'd just like to thank you for it, and I'd like to give this to you so that you will display it.
On behalf of the Resource Connection, I would like to say thank you to Congressman Lundgren for your support overall. When we applied for the loan with the USDA, he sent in a letter of support, which many of you also did. I'd also like to thank our community. As you all know, we've just gotten through the holiday season and successfully served well over 10% of our county's population with holiday food. And that couldn't have happened without our Santa's Express Committee, without the Rotary, the Lions Club, the VFW, our churches, our schools. We brought in over 28,000 pounds of food through a food drive, and that's from our community, our businesses, our families that donated money and time, and our volunteers. So really, this is for our community, and I just really want to say thank you. It's a privilege to work for the Resource Connection and to work at the Food Bank to serve our community. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for everything. Because this only works because we all do it together. Because in my former line of work, when I had to work with a few of the people in this room, not those on probation, I stuff like that. All people. I won't go near anonymity. But anyway, what life is really about is three things: food, shelter, and love. And the Resource Connection kind of works on it. And our whole community is. So if you put life to pretty simple things, your health's going to be good, you're going to feel good, and you're going to still love living here and working even in these tough times. So remember that. And just to give you kind of I can't read my shirt backwards, but the Resource Connection, our mission statement is pretty simple, and it's engaging families, empowering communities, and enriching lives. And we all do that. We'll do it together. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm just glad I got here. Over the last 2 weeks back in Washington, D.C., I've spent a total of 12 hours shoveling snow. It's the largest recorded snow season in the history of the D.C. area, and I think we're closing in on 50 inches. Now, for people in the mountains, so forth, that may not be a lot. But let me tell you, for Washington, D.C., that is a lot of snow. And also this week, our daughter-in-law was expecting her fourth child, and was expecting on Wednesday, which was the day of the blizzard. And luckily, that event was postponed to yesterday afternoon. So we have a new little granddaughter, Fiona Catherine, and she seems to be doing just fine. Although I'm here. They live back in the Virginia area, so it'll be about 10 days before I get to see her. Let me introduce members of my staff who are here. These are the people who, if you call on the phone, or you write us, or you email us, these are the people oftentimes you'll be speaking with and communicating with. Peter Tatishi, my Deputy Chief of Staff, he spends about 1 week a month back in Washington, D.C. Now, interestingly, he picked last week to be that week. So he arrived at Dulles Airport Monday night and couldn't even get in, stayed at the hotel out at Dulles Airport, then got into the office and had to take a hotel room 3 weeks from the Capitol. And our office was open, I just want you to know. In fact, on the one day he was there were exactly 14 people that showed up to work at the Rayburn House office building, and he was one of them. So he was back here. Marilyn Ernst, my administrative director. Marilyn has worked with me when I was Attorney General. She oversees the operations of the district office, helps us in administering appropriations requests, and manages outreach for the district office. Debbie Jones, special assistant, is with us, oversees the district budget, the district office budget, which is very important for me because if we go over budget, it comes out of my pocket. So she makes sure that doesn't happen. Handles scheduling in the district office, so she would be the one you would talk to about scheduling. Liz Donnelly, senior field representative, Liz conducts district outreach in a number of different communities in the Sacramento area. By the way, they mentioned that we're on one edge of the district. The other edge of the district is where we touch Lake Berryessa, right at the Napa County line. I don't go into Napa, but I do have parts of Solano County. They gave me all the parts of Solano County that nobody lives in. That's a very interesting way they cut that. Bob Ellert, Senior Field Representative. Bob has joined us from the dark side. Well, he used to work at SecMoney. I'm just kidding Bob. He actually is a veteran newsman from all over the country, and now is Senior Field Representative for us, and he is our direct contact to your county. So he spends time up here in Calaveras County as well as Amador, Alpine counties, and then he also gets over to Solano as well. Oliver Chu is our constituent services representative. He handles immigration issues, citizenship issues, military issues, postal service, office of personnel management, and helps with something else with the next person I'm going to introduce, and that's Michelle Panos, who's also a constituent services representative. She handles specific constituent issues dealing with the Veterans Affairs, Social Security, the IRS, Medicare, Department of State. And for those of you who haven't been to our town halls before, why would we be interested in working with you about Department of State if you're going outside the country and you need a passport? And I know it would happen to nobody in this room, but we do have people who call and say, I'm leaving for Europe tomorrow and I don't have my passport, what can you do? We can't work miracles, but she does a pretty good job at it. She works with Oliver in our military academy appointments. Now this is something that's extremely important because the military academies are established obviously for the purpose of giving education for and creating officers in our military services. But one of the things that we attempt to do is to make sure there's a national focus. There's national participation. That we have young people from all over the country. And the way that is done is by giving the appointments to the academies, to the members of Congress. And so we have basically the equal amount of appointments that we can make. And it depends on how many we have there as to how many we can appoint. There's supposed to be a total number that you have. Senators also make appointments. There's a small number that are presidential appointments and a small number get in under other conditions. But primarily it's the members of Congress and the Senate. And so what we attempt to do is to make sure that every high school in our district is aware of this, that students are aware of it, the teachers are aware of it, counselors are aware of it, the administrators are aware of it. And we try and be as fair as possible. And I have a panel of citizens, a number of whom are retired military, but not all, who sit on that panel. And after we get all the information from the students, and after we make sure that they qualify under the standards that have been established by the various service academies, we then have an interview process. And these members of the panel actually interview every single one of the students that's interested and actually scores them on leadership qualities, ability to interview, all sorts of things. Looks at their academic background, the leadership extracurricular activities that are involved in. And so if you know of a friend, if you know of a child, a son or a daughter, or a grandson or a granddaughter, a niece or nephew that might be interested, please let our office know and make sure that that student contacts us by their junior year so we can be assured that they have all of the academic requirements that are necessary as well as the extracurricular activities that the academies are looking for. Chris O'Connor is a congressional aide. He coordinates federal grants, handles our Native American affairs, and works very, very diligently on constituent opinion and correspondence. And then Brian Kavanagh. Brian is our communications director, normally in the Washington, D.C. office. Managed to get out yesterday as well from D.C. Also handles science, space, and technology issues. If anybody's interested in going back to D.C. and you're looking for tours, our office gives tours second to none. Just let us know ahead of time. Contact our district office or You can contact our DC office or visit our website at www.lundgren.house.gov. And if you haven't been to Washington, D.C. in a while, and you haven't visited the Capitol in a while, we have a new Congressional Visitor Center called the CDC, which now makes it an inviting experience for you to come to Washington, D.C. Before, I always used to think that members of the public might have felt that they were sort of an afterthought. Because if it was raining, or snowing, or sleeting, or it was 105 degrees in the summertime, we didn't have a comfortable place for you to wait. We stood in line outside. We had some temporary tents and housing out there. We now have a beautiful Congressional Visitor Center. It is underground on the east side of the Capitol. It has tremendous displays, a couple of films to start you off to understand the history of the Capitol. One of the things I'm most proud of is that when we were looking at how it was being built and the references that were made there, I thought that there was an absence of a recognition of religious heritage in the country and the place that religious heritage played with the Founding Fathers and the documents of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so I felt that we should have what is our official national motto in the CDC. And so I introduced legislation to have the words "In God We Trust," the national motto, actually engraved in marble as you come into the CDC, and also the words of the Pledge of Allegiance. And we managed to put the Pledge of Allegiance on a wall that all members will see as we go into the one room that could hold all members of the House and the Senate together if we have a meeting that is off the floor of the House or the Senate. And I wanted to make sure that all members walk by it as we walk through to conduct any business. And believe it or not, we got that passed almost unanimously in the House and unanimously in the Senate, and it is now engraved there. There is an organization suing us to try and get those out of there. They're out of Wisconsin. They claim to represent atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and free thinkers, is how they define themselves. And I don't think they're going to win in court because all we tried to do, all I was trying to do was to give recognition of the religious heritage, which is part and parcel of our history. And you can't understand the Declaration of Independence. I don't think you can understand the Constitution unless you have reference to the Declaration of Independence, or as Abraham Lincoln suggested. Essentially, the Constitution is informed by the Declaration of Independence. To understand the Constitution, you have to understand those principles that are contained in the Declaration of Independence. And when the Declaration of Independence states the words that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they were establishing a revolutionary idea for that time, that the relationship that we had to our government was essentially upside down from what it had been before. Before, the idea was the state was the great institution. And if it was a monarchy, the monarchy had a direct relationship with God. And we, as the subjects of the monarchy, only had the rights that the monarchy gave us. The Declaration of Independence said, no, that's not right. There's a direct relationship between our Creator, capital C, I think I know what you're talking about, and us. And we, therefore, have those rights directly given to us from God. And when we establish a government, it is we who give the powers to the government that we believe the government should have. And it's a revolutionary concept that was at the basis of this country. And I just think you don't have to be a believer in God to understand those foundations and to recognize those foundations and to understand that's why we have the form of government that we have today. And so we do have that number. Sound and fury about it. People want to have other things in there. There's this great big fight. We didn't look like we were going to go anywhere, so I quietly tried to write the legislation, work with Democrats on my committee and Republicans, then work with leadership. We got it passed. We worked with the Senate, the Democrats and Republicans, and got it done. And while everybody, well, not everybody, while others were just fighting over the thing, we just decided we'd get it done. And it's there now, so I'm very happy with that. Now, a couple of issues that we've got back in D.C. that I know you're concerned about, and again, you can ask any questions you want. We'll try and answer them as best we can. If I don't have the information right here, we'll try and get back to you. If there's something you have of a specific issue that affects you personally, it's not the best place to do it, standing up in front of everybody here, but I have staff people who will work with you. One of the things we do when we work on a case is we ask you to sign a sheet that allows us basically to get the records that you want us to look at, so we don't violate your privacy without your permission. And we're very careful about that. We also, it's nobody else's business. We're dealing with a case with you. Other people don't need to know. So we try and be respectful of your personal privacy as well. So if someone has an issue like that and they get to go into a specific case, I'm going to have to ask you to see one of my staff people. We'll work on that with you and ensure that we can try and get an answer for you. A couple of things that are happening. I mean, Senator Coburn said this week that the snowstorm proves that God exists because it made sure that we couldn't be in Congress passing more laws and taxing you more for at least that period of time. I'm not quite that cynical about it, but it wasn't for a period of time. Right now, the biggest issue in my estimation should be jobs. Second biggest issue should be jobs. Third biggest issue should be jobs. And all the way to the top 10 ought to be jobs. This economy is hurting very, very badly. We haven't seen a period of time like this in recent memory. Everybody knows it. We were going along for a period of time in which we actually saw unemployment rates right around 4 or 5% for a substantial period of time. Now we're seeing unemployment rates at 10% for the nation, slightly below that, 9.7%, the latest figures that just came in. But as those figures came in, we saw that we actually lost 800,000 more jobs than we thought we did. So what we're seeing is how can you lose jobs and have the unemployment rate go down? It is the phenomenon of the discouraged worker. That is, if you're no longer looking for work, we don't count you in those statistics. So you can literally have a period of time, and this is what happens when you have an extended period of time of high unemployment. People get discouraged from working, so the universe of people that are looking for work is reduced, and therefore the number of people who are working versus the universe of people who are looking for work may look better percentage-wise, but overall you've lost jobs. We haven't seen that phenomenon for a long period of time. We are seeing it right now. In California, we're worse than that. We're at 12%. Parts of my district are higher than that. Parts of this county are higher than that. So the question is, what do we do about it? There are at least two major approaches to it. One is stimulus package after stimulus package after stimulus package. The other is trying to do something to get the private sector going. Some say, well, you can do both. So I'll just give you an idea on how I feel about this. The President made an interesting comment 2 weeks ago when he spoke to us in the joint session of Congress in the State of the Union address, when he said, if we follow those economic policies we had in the last 10 years, it will lead us to what we call the lost decade. Now, I thought it was interesting the President said that because I've never heard anybody apply that terminology here in the United States. Economists in the world are looking at two different countries, one Sweden and one Japan, in the 1990s. They looked at what Sweden did when they had a true banking crisis, where Sweden set up a system where the government went in and took the toxic assets essentially off the books of their banks, set them aside, allowed a number of banks to go under, but then strengthened their system, and within 3 years worked themselves out of their problem. And it's not an absolute example for us because they are certainly more socialistic than we are, and they have nationalization more than we do. But nonetheless, the approach they used was to try and get some toxic assets off the books of the banks, made them recognize when they were in trouble, allowed some of the banks to fail. On the other side, Japan, facing the same problem, failed to address the problem, and still some of their banks are in trouble. Did not recognize the difficulty they had with the banks or the bad assets that were on there. Instead, went through a series, I believe it's 7, you could count it to see 11, but I'd say at least 7 separate stimulus packages passed by the government of Japan, which resulted in what economists have called the lost decade. So I thought it was somewhat ironic, at least for me, because I've been studying these two countries, to to see what would guide me in terms of what I would support. You see, the president criticizing a certain direction and suggesting that unless we go through stimulus packages, more stimulus packages, we will have a lost decade. Because frankly, I think that's just the reverse of the lesson we learned from the Japanese experience. So, we had one stimulus package. We had what we called son of stimulus, which we passed in December. I voted against both of them. And now we're talking about having an even greater stimulus package coming up. And what that means is the federal government, which is running the largest deficits in the history of the United States since World War II, $1.6 trillion we think coming on, will therefore be required to borrow more money, to spend more money, to somehow take us out of this economic downturn. Now there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, who are we going to borrow from? The largest foreign investor or person from whom we borrow right now is China. When the president went to China several months ago, the Chinese officials told him that we were borrowing too much money. The Chinese officials told us that we were borrowing. Communist Chinese had to tell us we were borrowing too much money. Several weeks later, the finance minister of China made a statement that the world did not have enough wealth to purchase more debt for the United States. I mean, this is China telling us a second time. And so then what happened last week? The Chinese army, the leaders of the Chinese army are telling the Chinese government that they ought to get rid of some of the U.S. debt, not because of economic reasons, but to punish us. Because we have decided to be consistent with our dedication to Taiwan by selling some armaments to Taiwan so they can protect themselves. So for the very first time, and it's no longer hypothetical, that they might be thinking about using their leverage over us for political/military purposes, they actually started talking about it openly. Now, will they do that? No one knows, but it's a shot across our bow that they're doing that. So that's the scenario we find ourselves in. As I've said in some other town hall meetings, I used to say the difference between the federal government and the state government was the federal government could print money and the state couldn't. But California proved me wrong. Because California printed IOUs for a period of time, which is really quasi-currency. And after 2 months, major banks in the United States said, we're not going to take your IOUs anymore. Why? Because the federal government and their regulators were telling them they had to get their books in line, and they had to make sure that they were doing prudent banking. Now, I think some of the regulations we have on the banks is overkill from the standpoint of not allowing loans to small business. That's another issue we could talk about. But nonetheless, they made a rational business decision. They were no longer going to take IOUs from California. What's to say China won't do the very same thing and act on what they've warned us about? So, how do you get the economy going? If you analyze the economy for the last 20, 30, 40 years, you see most jobs are created in the private sector in small and medium-sized businesses. So how do we get small and medium-sized businesses going? It seems to me tax cuts are the way that we've done it in the past, and the tax cuts are the way we have to do it now. The president at least acknowledged that by saying we want to have some very specific tax cuts for small business, for tax credits, for hiring new people. I'm in support of that, but frankly, you ought to take the concept further and give tax cuts across the board for small business and individual taxpayers. I would suspend the payroll tax for 6 months to a year. It would be less of a hit on our treasury than the expenditures were going, and it would inject money immediately in the individual's pockets of the employer and the employee. It would particularly help those in small business and would encourage them to hire sooner than they would. If we're going to have any kind of stimulus package from government spending, it seems to me they ought to go into those things that we know we need: bridges, roads, improve our bridges, improve our roads, and for projects that are truly ready to go. I would also vote for accelerating the environmental reviews of those projects to get those going sooner rather than later. And also in the area of our defense, our military, we are eating up a lot of the equipment for our military. We have to replace that equipment. We know that's going to have to be done. Why not accelerate the purchase and production of that equipment now? So that's not something that will put a lag on the economy when it starts really coming back. because it's something we know we have to do. We can do it quickly, it would employ a lot of people. That's what I would do. Now, I think the president has other views, but I thought at least I ought to get mine out. The other issue that's rather important out there, the other two issues that are rather important out there are first, the health care bill. I've been trying to make my position clear with town hall meetings, town halls, my newsletters, and so forth. My position has been that no one that I know of back in D.C. is for the status quo. Everybody believes we need some changes or improvements in the healthcare system. The question is what type. A total overhaul, which I believe is what the Senate and the House put forward, what the President was strongly favoring, or what we would refer to as more of a, to use a phrase, surgical intervention, incremental, specific changes that would improve both accessibility and help as best we can to limit the rising costs. How do you do that? I think we had a failed plan in the House and the Senate, which really was going to lead to a government takeover. We can go into that, and I can answer questions and hear what you have to say on that. But there's just a number of elements of those bills that would have led us in that direction. Secondly, some people have called, well, there's a movie called something about inconvenient truth. I would say the Constitution is an inconvenient truth. There are some things people would like to do the Constitution doesn't allow us to. The Supreme Court just told us. Congress cannot limit free speech, depending on whether you're an individual, a corporation, a union, an association. They said, the First Amendment says, the Congress shall make no law abridging speech. And so, some people would say, well, it would be better for the political system if we could abridge it in this way. Well, the inconvenient truth is that the First Amendment doesn't allow you to do it. So you either want to amend the First Amendment, which I don't think we want to do, or you have to accommodate the First Amendment and work with it. Similarly, this bill, both the House and the Senate version, says on its face, in both versions, that there will be an absolute federal requirement for each and every one of you, if you are to remain a legal person in the United States, must purchase health care through insurance, some program, as determined on an annual basis by the Congress and certain health officials in Washington, D.C. I don't think the Constitution gives us that power. Because what they're saying for the first time is, in order for you to remain a citizen, actually a person in good standing in the United States, you must purchase a product that you may or may not want. Now, some people will say, well, wait a second, to create a system of health care for this country, it would be best if everybody would be required to have health insurance. And they would be required to have it to these specifications. But the inconvenient truth is, the Constitution, I don't believe, gives me the power to insist that you do that. Now, some people say, wait a second, it's like car insurance. Well, first of all, you don't need car insurance if you don't have a car. Secondly, if you have a car and you keep it on your property and never drive it on the roads, you don't need to have car insurance. It is not that you have a right to be on public roads. It is considered a privilege to be on public roads under the law. It is not a right. I never knew that if you were a legal citizen of the United States, it was only a privilege that you remained a citizen. I thought it was your right. And suddenly we have said that right will be abridged by the federal government unless you purchase something. Now some people say, well, it's for a good purpose. Well, it may be for a good purpose. I would like to see everybody covered. But think about this. If the government can demand that you do that, why couldn't the government say to you, we have a problem with obesity in this country, and therefore we're going to command each and every one of you to purchase a membership at a health club that must have you do these things pursuant to the federal government's authority. You know, I mean, I could argue that obesity is a real problem in this country. that it drives up the cost for all of us, that it puts many of us in difficulty with respect to our health care, that we're cheating one another by not being healthier. But I don't think the Constitution gives you that right to do that. So I think that's a problem. And you have to understand, the insurance companies, many of them signed on to the proposals in the House and the Senate precisely because they saw that they were going to have a captive audience. There was going to be an obligation, everybody had to buy their product. Talk about monopoly. Not only do you have a monopoly, but then you have to. And if you didn't, you'd have to pay a fine. If you didn't have to pay a fine, you go to jail. Man, I could even sell something if those were the penalties you didn't buy my product. So I don't think it's as easy to do. I would like us to have some tort reform. I've had experience in the law on that for a number of years, practicing in the courts in California. I think that could help bring costs down, not just in terms of direct costs, but indirect costs. There's a lot of defensive medicine going on. A lot of studies, a lot of tests that are done that your doctor will tell you he doesn't or she doesn't really think you need, but they're protecting themselves against lawsuits. And we need to address that. This bill does it in a strange way, the one that's before the House and the Senate. It says that we're going to create incentives on the federal government and states to look at alternatives to litigation to resolve these disputes. But it says, if your state either limits the amount of money that the attorney gets or has any limitation on non-economic damages, both of which we have in California, your state is penalized, you cannot participate. So only those states that have actually done something to try and deal with this issue would be penalized. It's worse than doing nothing at all. It takes us back over 30 years. So anyway, those are some of the outlines of it. The President's going to have a meeting in the White House, actually across the street from the White House at Blair House. He's inviting our leadership on the Republican and Democratic sides of the House and the Senate. It's going to be televised. But here's the problem. He said in an interview just this week, we're not going to start over. Now, I don't know if you saw, the latest poll shows that 61% of the American people would rather have us take those bills that are out there in the House and the Senate off the table and have us start again. I have to make the other thing that's extremely important, it's really the reason I ran for Congress to go back in the election in 2004, that is to respond to the threat of those who would use terror to take away our freedom, to kill us, to try and undo what we have created in this country. When we left before Christmas to come home, Democrats met, we met on the floor, but the Democrats met in their group, they call it caucus. We met on the Republican side in our group, we call it a conference. And as we were going home, our leadership said, look, there's two big issues out there, jobs, and health care. And they went through all those. This is before we came home to Christmas. And I got up to the microphone and I said, well, there's another big issue as far as I'm concerned, and that's the threat of terror. And even though a lot of people aren't thinking about it now, we ought to think about it, because we have to deal with three elements, three parts of the Patriot Act that have to be reauthorized or they go out of existence. We have to figure out what we're going to do with trying people. We have to understand what we're going to do with Guantanamo. My position is Guantanamo ought to stay open. I haven't think we ought to try in there. I haven't think we ought to use military tribunals. But it was difficult to get people. It was difficult to get people to listen to that, because when we had the terrible event, the terrible attack down in Fort Hood by a doctor in the military who killed 13 servicemen and women and an unborn child. And I happen to believe that political correctness allowed him to stay in that. This was someone who had on his card, his official card, SOA, Soldier of Allah, who had at briefings talked about the appropriateness of killing Americans, who had given all sorts of indications that this was troublesome, and yet he was kept in for, I think, two reasons: political correctness, and also because we have a difficulty in attracting doctors, particularly psychiatrists, to the military. But that aside, we still haven't had that sense of urgency. So they said, yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks for bringing it up. You know, we've got to work on that. When we come back, we'll work on it. I had no idea on Christmas Day we'd have the attempted terrorist attack in Detroit. But we did. But we did. And so now we have to figure out how we're going to handle this. And we have a real debate in this country that I think is worth engaging in. The question is, do you take somebody like the terrorist in Detroit and give him all of the constitutional rights that you have as a citizen of the United States? And the reason I pose that question is this. Constitutional rights fully attached to Americans and people in the United States. Constitutional rights in that same way have never attached to someone on the battlefield. Because the only connection that person has with the United States is that we captured them or we killed them as they were trying to kill us. That's the only connection. And that has never been viewed under our law, international, or any other way to grant them all the protections of the law of the country they are trying to destroy. And yet we have said by our actions in Detroit that we will not only grant you all those rights, we will do it immediately. We will give you Miranda warning, which tells you don't tell us anything. Now, the whole idea when you capture someone on the battlefield is to try and get information from them that will help you not prosecute them, but help you stop other light attackers from killing you and your fellow soldiers, or in this case, fellow citizens. And so we have a very, very big question as to how we are going to handle it. And I think the best expert on this issue is a fellow named Michael Casey. I don't know if many of you know who he is. He was the Attorney General in the last year and a half of the Bush administration. Before that, he was a federal judge. And he was a federal judge who presided over terrorist trials that were held in New York. Yes, this was during the Bush administration. But he will tell you now, as will members of the previous administration, we were trying to figure out how to do it. We learned things from that, and we ought to take those lessons and apply them now. And one of the things Judge McCasey will say is it is an absolute mistake to Mirandize somebody like that right away, number one. Number two, he believes it's a mistake to try them in our U.S. civil court system, the civilian court system, and that they ought to be tried in the military court system. And one of the reasons he gives is, in one of the cases in which we were able to successfully prosecute a terrorist, there was something on the order of, I think, 200 people named, not named, they were unnamed co-conspirators. The defense made a request to know the identity of the unnamed co-conspirators. Under the law that prevails in our criminal justice system, they were granted that. Those names then were made available to Al-Qaeda, and they then learned, by connecting the dots they didn't have before, who we were going after, who we knew something about, and exactly the connections that we were making among them. And it hurt us tremendously in the process. So there are a lot of things that are being said. When the head of the anti-terrorism effort in the White House, Mr. Brennan, said, look, we can get more information by plea bargaining with them than we can by intense interrogation. I want to tell you, as a former Attorney General of the state of California, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He is dead wrong. They're now saying we're getting information out of this guy because we brought his family here. 5 weeks later, he lost the ability to get that information in the first few days when it would be the freshest. We now know, we now have given up the information that his parents cooperated with us. Now, it's just, it's wrong, I believe. But we ought to debate this openly. We ought to be upfront about it. We ought to make decisions about it as a country. We ought to decide what our Constitution stands for and what it doesn't stand for. So those would be, I think, the three major issues that I would suggest that we're talking about in D.C. right now. There are a lot of other issues I know that are here that are local. We've been working with some of you on a number of these issues, and I'd love to talk to you about that. But with that, I'm happy to open up any questions that anybody might have. I'm going to start way in the back, just so I show that I'm not showing favorites. Here's a mic.
Where
the people that have been feeding at the public trough in Washington, I want them to have the same health care as Jim and got on our place. The other thing is,
There were some exceptions made in that last bill. One is that federal employees would be treated differently, including members of Congress, and unions would be specifically exempted from the same rules. I think because that was exposed, I don't think that's going to apply. So I don't think you're going to have to worry about that kind of thing happening.
the other thing, does that mean that all these elected officials are going to have my health care before it's going to be?
Well, no, I mean, it all depends when they come out with it. That's not what I'm supporting. I'm supporting, and my side is supporting greater competition, more opportunities for a multiplicity of healthcare programs available to each and every American, that you'd be able to make purchases across state lines, so that you would have programs such as federal employees have, but you'd have other programs that would be available to you for you to make your choice or your employer to make your best choice.
The other thing is, I'm wondering when Nancy Pelosi is going to be arrested for misappropriating the American taxpayers' money by flying her family all over the world at our expense. Now, I know she pays like $480 for her ticket, but it's hundreds of thousands of dollars for her to have that military jet fly her wherever she or her family wants to go. And that is wrong.
Well, I'll just tell you, they do have a precedent that allows the Speaker of the House, no matter how much I disagree with her, the ability to have military plane available to her based on the fact that she is third in line in succession as President of the United States. Let me just... And I might say this, I've never been invited to fly in her aircraft, even though her district is within 70 miles of mine. It is something that can be justified, if not abused. And I will let the taxpayers decide whether they think it's being abused right now. Yes, ma'am, right up there in front. We're going to give our guys a workout because they're not going to the gym today.
How close is Pelosi to getting the House reps to pass the Senate bill for representation?
Question is, how close is Speaker Pelosi to getting the House to pass the Senate bill and then utilize reconciliation? The answer is, I don't know, and I don't think she knows at this point in time. If they had the votes, they would have done it before we left. If they had the votes right now, they wouldn't be so worried about it. I don't think they have the votes. They wanted to pass this before we went home in July. They wanted to pass it before we came home in August. They wanted to pass it immediately when we got back from August. You know, we finally passed it just before Christmas. And they had to pull some strings to have us do that. Since that time, of course, we've seen what happened in the Senate, the Louisiana Purchase, the Nebraska corn hustle, all those various things. And that gave them black eyes all over the place. And then we had the election in Massachusetts. Now, I went on the floor of the House in October, November, and I talked about how the fact is that I grew up with something known as the Julian calendar. The first one, the Julian calendar was the first one by Julius Caesar, and then we had the Gregorian calendar by Pope Gregory, which we use today, but now we must have the Pelosian calendar, because the Pelosian calendar only has 11 months because you ignore what happened in August. But I think it's difficult for her to ignore what happened in January with the election that took place in Massachusetts. You see something that just happened this last week in New York State. They had 4 special elections for the legislature there. 3 were won by the minority party, the Republican Party. Nobody thought that was going to happen. I mean, something is happening out there. And members on the Democratic side, particularly blue dogs, are beginning to take note of it. And so that's why I would say it is uncertain right now. The longer it snows, the greater the chance we have to stop. Meaning that the longer the time is out there, the more the American people look at it, the more they say, you know, We want some changes, but not these changes. And I think members are beginning to react to it. Here's the secret on reconciliation. Reconciliation is supposed to be a budget process. As a result, and it's very arcane in the Senate, but just briefly, it's ways for them to deal with budget issues where they don't have to worry about someone filibustering, so they don't have to have 60 votes, they just need 51. But because it's limited to the budget, they can't do everything that's in that bill. So what would have to happen is you would have to get members of the House to vote for the Senate bill with all the problems in it and have to stand up for that based on the promise that then they would pass reconciliation afterwards to come over to us to take care of some of the problems. Now that's a big if. And it would be considered a distortion of the reconciliation process in the Senate. So I don't know whether it's as easy as some suggest. In addition, now you have the president with his televised, I don't know what we're going to call it. I don't know if it's going to be a debate. I don't know whether it's going to be, exactly how it's going to be. But that's sort of the joker in the deck right now. What is that going to do? Now, I was in Baltimore at the Republican conference, again, where we got snowed in. Just barely got out of there 2 weekends ago, or 2.5 weekends. 2 weekends ago. And the president then came and spoke before us in our Republican meeting. That was the first time we ever had a president of the opposite party come in and talk to the organized opposition party in public. And it was very interesting there. The president handles himself very well in terms of being articulate and being able to handle questions. But if you really listen to what he said, in my judgment, he said, well, first, it was interesting. For the whole year, we've had, the whole last year, the leadership on the majority side and the White House has said that we are the party of no. We have no ideas. All we are is obstructionists. Yet during that meeting, the president validated us because what he said was, you've got ideas. I've taken some of your ideas and put it in my legislation. I've read your ideas. He said to Paul Ryan from Wisconsin, I've read your bill. I think there's good parts to it. Well, he went on for about 7 minutes there talking about how we had ideas and we could use some of them, but others we had to look at them. How could we, for a year, not given any ideas when the president's read them? So what it did was it established in the minds of the public through the major media that there were ideas, there were competing ideas. And you say, well, some of us knew that. Well, the major media wasn't putting that message out. Now, when the president said it, they have to acknowledge it. So I think that was good to help begin the debate. But at the same time, the president kept saying, but I've got to have my experts look at it. I have to have my experts there. My experts have to tell me whether it's right. He said that to Tom Price, a congressman from Georgia, who is a doctor who has practiced orthopedic surgery for 25 or 30 years. And the product that Tom Price was asking the president about was a bill that he had come up with along with, I think, 7 or 8 other doctors. Well, Tom didn't get a chance to say it, but had I been in his shoes, I would have said, with all due respect, Mr. President, if you're looking for experts, there's 8 of us here who practice medicine for a combination of 400 years. We think we've got some pretty good ideas, that's why we're doing it. But we weren't able to engage that much. So this has taken on a life of its own. Believe me, no one could have thought this was going to happen at this point. The majority party has a 80-vote margin over the minority party in the House. Unbelievable. They can lose 39 votes and still beat us. They had until the election in Massachusetts, 60 votes in the Senate. Those are super majorities. And even with that, they couldn't move this. So that means it's not just Republicans who are against it. It has to mean the Democrats that are against it. It has to mean the independents that are against it. And so maybe we ought to look at see what they're against. And maybe trying to figure out something else that we can all be for. So this thing is fluid. I mean, this thing, if I weren't in it, it would be really kind of interesting to be standing outside just kind of looking at it. Because it is a tremendous, well, I mean, a lot of times politics or making laws is dull and boring. This is not. They're hand grenades being lobbed in all over the place.
Why do they even have this meeting out there when they're trying to overreact?
Why are they trying this new meeting? Because, well, 2 reasons. One is they've been criticized for making the law behind closed doors. So now they're going to open the door for 2 hours. And secondly, the president believes that he scored well in the meeting with us in Baltimore. And if you listen to what he says, if you look, this is his honest opinion. He believes, as he has said in there, that if he only has more opportunities to explain it, people will finally understand. Look, if I were to give the president advice, I'd say, look, the best thing you do, Mr. President, is get on TV and say, I wouldn't say I've listened to Republicans, I'd say I've listened to the American people. And the American people have told us that despite the fact that we spent all this time doing this, we've gone down the wrong road. I now acknowledge that. I'm telling you, the American people, I've heard what you had to say, and I'm asking the Republicans and Democrats to start over, and I will be at the table with them, and we will have it open, and people will see everything that's happening, because I'm listening to the American people. That's what I do. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. Well, again, I hope he does. It'd be best for the country if he does. Somebody else in the back. Yes, sir. I know, I'll make sure I'm my answer. My mom were here, she'd say, yeah, she loves mom.
Okay, let's combine the two, healthcare and the jobs. I hear over and over from, small business people, it's really not just the taxes that kind of make you queasy at the time, and reducing taxes is a good idea, but it's all the uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen in healthcare. We don't know what's going to happen in the future of taxes. And it's really the uncertainty. Can we get to the point where, okay, this is off the table and we can now plan our businesses and move forward in that way? I think the uncertainty is the bigger problem in the current jobs market than anything else that Washington is doing.
I agree with you. Look, I only took one economics class at Notre Dame, but I do remember when they were talking about, there's certain laws of economics, but you also want to know how people are going to react to certain things in the future. And the more uncertainties you have out there, the more risk you're taking. And so the greater the uncertainty, if you're loaning money out there, the greater uncertainty, the greater the premium. And in a very real sense, the greater the uncertainty out there, the greater the premium on the economy. The tougher it is for small business and medium-sized and large business to make decisions because they don't know what they're going to face. And so rather than take the risk of hiring an additional person or additional 10 people, not knowing whether you can keep them on the payroll after a year because you're going to get hit by regulation, you're going to get hit by taxation, or this healthcare thing, you're not sure what's going to happen. You don't hire people. That is part of what our problem is right now. So yes, I would agree with you. I would think it would be better if the president said what I just suggested he say. I think at least there would be certainty that we're not going to pass that particular bill with that onus that people are worried about. Secondly, the one thing that's certain right now in terms of the president's tax policy is he's going to let the Bush tax cuts expire. Now this is the way language gets turned around. I'm not blaming the president for this, I'm just telling you the way Washington works. When the Bush tax cuts came into effect, they were across the board, dropped tax rates for everybody, had certain capital gains tax treatment and so forth. But because of rules they have in the Senate and the way they quote-unquote score bills, they couldn't allow those tax cuts to be permanent. They could only be for 7 years. That's why we're coming up. It's not some immutable law of economics. It's not because people are running around saying, raise our taxes. It's because of this rule in the House, in the Senate. And here's the other secret. When you deal with budgeting, it is required for the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, as well as for OMB and the other elements of the executive branch. When they project the budgets out a number of years, they have to assume the laws as they then exist. So if the Bush tax cuts are to fall off the table, starting in 1 or 2 years, they build that into their budget projections. So they assume there's going to be the same amount of economic activity, but they're going to take a higher bite out of that economic activity by way of taxes. So they then say, if you then extend those tax cuts, you're creating a deficit. Why? Because we've already put a claim on that money. So that's what happened. The other thing we use in Washington is a term Teddy Kennedy used to use all the time called tax expenditure. When we pass a tax cut, we figure out the lost revenues to the government, and that's the tax expenditure. As if the government had the money in the first place. Now think about environment, it makes it very difficult to understand that if you work and produce something, you own that money first, the government doesn't. And so the way the rules have worked is, they call this pay-go, you know, they talk about pay-go, we're not going to pass anything unless we pay for it. Again, the way it works is, if it's built into the program, all kinds of permanent spending programs, you don't have to pay for it. In other words, you don't have to increase taxes for it, you don't have to find cuts in. But if you put a tax cut in, you have to find other taxes to go up to take care of that. And so it works against the idea that most jobs are created in the private sector. You have to have a vibrant private sector in order to produce the tax revenues that will allow the government to do the job that it can do. And so that's what we're having now. I mean, all we have to do is look at Greece right now, look at Spain right now. They're going broke. Look at California right now. It is broke. And on the federal level, you know, this is deficit spending on steroids. We just can't keep it up. Yes, sir.
My concern is I have difficulty with health care being a right versus a privilege. I am both a union person, most constituents, and a teacher. I am finding more of the undocumented or illegals taking jobs away from those that deserve a living wage. The legal person's getting paid $30 an hour, the illegal's getting paid $15 an hour. The legal person is taking less home to the family. So my concern is, why aren't we enforcing the laws that are already on the books that are enabling our borders to be flooded by the illegals that are taking away our workforce that contributes to Medicare Part A and Part B? We have a system that's upside down. The workforce is 80% of our job force. Now, how are we going to correct that, which all encompasses everything? Everybody wants Medicare. Everybody wants health care. The legals are paying for it. The illegals are not paying for it, but they still get services. And we take home less money for the family.
I think there's several questions in there. Let me try and respond. First of all, is health care a right? It all depends what you mean by right. Some people believe health care is a right such that they have the right to reach into your pocket to pay for their health care. I mean, that's an absolute right. I believe that first and foremost, you're responsible for your health care. I'm responsible. The government has an obligation to try and make sure there is access to health care. The government has an obligation to license health care providers, hospitals, and so forth. The government has the obligation to go after fraud, dishonesty, those sorts of things. And I think we would agree that along with private institutions, the government has some responsibility to ensure that people who fall through the cracks and don't follow their own are helped. But I heard this the other day. Someone said to me, think of it this way: the larger government gets, the smaller the individual gets. And that's an essential question about the relationship that we have to our government. I'm not anti-government, but I am one of those who believes that one of the genius aspects of this country is that we have the proper relationship. That government has only those powers we allow it to have. That we have rights given to us by God. I'm talking about real rights, not fabricated rights. And if you go back and if you read anything that de Tocqueville wrote, he talks about one of of the great things about America was that we were joiners. We joined voluntary organizations. And a lot of what in Europe the government was presumed to have responsibility to do, we did ourselves. Or we did it through our families, or we did it through organizations, or we said we did it through our churches. Now look, I happen to be born and raised in Catholic school. One of the things that I was taught was a principle called the principle of subsidiarity. Actually, Pope Leo XIII wrote this in an encyclical in the late 1800s. It's very consistent with the notion of federalism in the United States. The principle of subsidiarity basically says that while we are social animals or individuals, that we live in society, we have an obligation as individuals to take care of ourselves. And we have an obligation to be the best we can be and to be as vibrant as we can be in this society. And that as we organize ourselves, we first organize ourselves into families, and then voluntary organizations, and then local governments, and then more distant governments, and then finally national government. And that concept is something that's deeply embedded in the American experience that Tocqueville talked about. And so the more vibrant all members of society are, the better the country's going to be. It's like if you think of, we used to use the term body politic to talk about the whole population. If you think of the body politic as a human body, if I only have oxygenated blood that goes to the brain, man, my body's going to fall apart. Even though my brain is functioning after a while, I can't function without my body. The strongest part is if you have oxygenated blood going to all parts of your body and all parts are functioning well. It's the same thing with our society. If all of us are energized to be active and working and feel a sense of responsibility, we'll have a better country. The alternative is, as you push more and more off the government, you have a sense of both dependence on the government and you have a lack of responsibility on yourself. Now, I know I'm talking in general terms, but I think we have to do that at times. So when someone says to me, is there an absolute right to medical care? I have to say, what do you mean by right? If what you mean by right is that the government is responsible for giving me and everybody else medical care, I would disagree with you. If you would say that yes, we believe as a caring society that all should have an opportunity to have health care, the question is, how do you provide it? And if the first responsibility is on me as an individual, and then to take care of my family, and that goes out from there, I think then you provide more health care in the long run. And sociologists refer to those organizations between the individual and government as mediating institutions. Fancy word for saying voluntary associations, organizations that we all join, and those sorts of things. So that's a long way about answering your question. I think it's important for us to understand we have rights talk in this country. As a professor of law at Harvard, Mary Ann McClendon, who was ambassador to Vatican for the last year of the Bush administration, and she wrote a book called Rights Talk. And she talked about the fact that now we talk about rights all the time. And it's almost all of our vocabulary. Or Scalia, Justice Scalia says it differently. He said when he was a kid, growing up, and you saw something you didn't like or you thought was wrong, your response would be, there ought to be a law. He says today you go walking around, you see something you don't like, you say it's unconstitutional. Now the difference is, in the first instance, if you think something ought to be done, you say there ought to be a law. You have the burden of persuading your fellow citizens to pass a law. That's the democratic process. If you define it as constitutional, you and I can't change it. It's what 9 judges say. I've got great respect for judges, but someone put it the other way to me. It says judges are nothing but lawyers and roads. Gives you a little different view of what they are. But and then on the illegals, look, illegal aliens. I've worked on this for 30-some years. We're doing more than we ever have in terms of securing our border. We need to do more. We've actually seen a real decline in illegal entry into the United States in this last year and a half because of the economy. I happen to believe that we need to have even tougher controls on the border, but I do believe this. I believe that we ought to set up a system where we determine, as United States citizens, our government how many people, foreign workers that we allow in this country, for what purpose, and I would have them stay as temporary workers and set up a system where they're encouraged to keep their families back home, where they're encouraged to go back home. Some people say that's cruel, you shouldn't allow it. Look, I got people who work for me, I've got friends who have men and women serving in Afghanistan and Iraq. They don't even have their families here and there. And they serve for long periods of time. And somehow I have greater sympathy for our men and women in the armed forces and their families than I do for saying, well, gee, it's unfair to have someone come to the United States who work temporarily and not have their family here. You know? We as a sovereign nation have the right to make that decision. I've got the Mexican ambassador to the United States coming into my district next Wednesday to appear at a forum for me. And it's very interesting. The fellow who heads up the Mexican consulate in Sacramento came in to see me yesterday, and I read the press release that came out when he first came in. He said, you know, we understand the problem of illegal immigration. We want to work with you. It's the same thing that we see when we have illegal aliens come from Central America to Mexico. It was very interesting to see that they are beginning to see on their southern border, recognize that's causing problems there. So, first thing we got to do is be honest about it, open about it, you know, tell it like it is, and then try and deal with it. Laws on the books that are not being enforced right now. Well, the biggest one would be employer sanctions. I've been one of those who supports an E-Verify program, which is an electronic verification program for employers to make it easier on them as well as easier on the government. And I think that we ought to mandate it. It's a voluntary program now. It ought to be mandated. Let's see someone. All right, it's time for another lady. Yes. Yes.
I'd like to change places right now, for a different topic. Term limits. How feasible is it that Congress would impose term limits on themselves? And how feasible is it that citizens of the United States would sign a petition to get it on the law, to get it on the agenda for the next election?
I don't think it's very feasible that the Congress is going to do that. Even when we try and make some changes, if we got agreement in the House, I'm sure the Senate is going to go along with it. And a state, I don't think a state can impose those on federal office. We have done it here in the state of California, you know. I was the Attorney General at the time. I defended the term limits law before the California Supreme Court. When we had that case, we read the law as it was put in by the people through the constitutional amendment, by the way proposition. And we noted that the language was different than that in the Constitution about limits for the President of the United States. So we thought it would be too much for us to argue that it was a lifetime ban. So we argued essentially that it was a sequential ban, meaning that in the legislature, you'd have the number of terms you were allowed, you'd have to drop out at least for one term, then you could run again. We were surprised when the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Justice Malcolm Lucas, wrote the opinion in which he said it was a lifetime ban. Something we were afraid if we argued in the court, they would have rejected. So that's how you got the lifetime ban here in California. I was a supporter of it. I have been very disappointed in the way it's worked. I don't think you can argue that the state legislature is better today than it was before those term limits. And part of the problem is actually you don't have any, you lack institutional memory there. Staff has a greater, staff's great, my guys are great, but staff should not dominate. You know, you don't elect staff, you elect the members. And right now, too much power is given to the staff because they're the only ones with institutional memory. And there's sort of a short-term view of things by the legislature. So while I was a strong supporter of term limits, and while I defended it on your behalf before the California Supreme Court, oh, I'm sorry, there's another man back.
I had really mixed emotions about coming here today.
So now,
I do thank you for coming, Congressman. What I would like to say is more probably more of a statement than it is a question, although it would be hoping to answer for sure. The reason I finally got here is I realized that you were in Congress and all the bad stuff was done. I'd like to speak to you from the banker's perspective of almost 50 years, largely manager, that the number one problem that caused what you call the banking crisis, and rightly so, I think it's a Congress crisis. And I can give you 6 or 7 examples that I just irrefutable. The first one was the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which lay dormant for 25 years, certainly well intended. What it basically did and said was that we want bankers to make loans to unqualified people. And the FDIC went so far as to have 2 examination divisions. One was called Safety and Soundness, which I think speaks for itself. The other one was CRA Enforcement. And they had a separate examination period. They wouldn't even talk to each other. Safety and Soundness said, we want safety in the banks. The Community Reinvestment examiners said, you're not making enough CRA loans. I said, I made some wise comments. Calaveras County, most of the loans we make are CRA. And we're darn proud of the job we did here in Calaveras and surrounding counties. I was the founding president and chairman 22 years presenting this year. And I've been introduced as an icon of California Bank. So I maybe have some credibility in this. Some of the other things that happened along the way is that you had certain Congress people in both houses that, in my view, overstepped, they painfully overstepped their boundaries, their positions as Congress people. And what they did is they forced Fannie and Freddie into making loans that never should have been made. Fannie and Freddie used to be bastions of conservancies. Well, after these Congress people, they all have a different language. And they're all from the Northeast. That's probably all I have to say about it. I'm trying to survive this. Anyway, many other things did happen. One, Congress passed a lot of the only individual deductions were for mortgage interest. The country flocked to equity loans and refinancing their home loans. And many viewed it as an ATM machine. And if people would buy a house for $100,000, and wait up to $250,000 in debt, they couldn't make the payment. So what did you do with the other $150,000? That was done. But that was another matter. I'd like to go on a bit, but I just want to mention how opposed I am to cap and trade. I think that it's an ill-conceived thing. If you're not aware of cap and trade, please have a look at what it says. But essentially, you'd have to have a license, a green license, on your property to be able to sell it. And my estimation is reading it would be more than their taxes, more than their property taxes, if they wouldn't be bound by our property. Anyway, you can go on to thank you.
Okay, well, let me respond to you about this. Congratulations. I first went to Congress in 1979, so the Community Reinvestment Act was passed before I got there. It got a tremendous impetus, first in the Carter administration, and then in the Clinton administration. And what they did was, they actually threatened, and I believe it was, and I may be wrong on this, but I think the current governor of Massachusetts, Paul Patrick, was in the Justice Department, and threatened criminal action against banks if they did not make more of those loans you're talking about. Secondly, Freddie and Fannie had been going further and further out on the limb, getting into the area of overtaking the entire industry and pushing banks to make more loans without concern about what was behind the loan. And there was a congressman from Louisiana named Richard Baker, a Republican, who tried to look into this and stop this, and he was stymied. And then when I came back to Congress in 2005, maybe it's because I was gone for a while, I came back and I said, oh my God, Franny and Freddie had gone so much. I wasn't on the relevant committee, which is the financial services, but when they brought a couple of things to the floor, there were about 38 of us at one point in time who tried to restrict Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we were trying to get them to have standards of the kind that we were imposing on financial institutions on them. And then we had hearings, and the Bush administration actually put in their budget submission that we were running into trouble with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that we could, not too distant future, see a point in which the taxpayers were going to have to bail them out. And they held hearings on this, and Barney Frank, who was the lead Democrat on the committee, now the chairman of the committee, basically made fun of the administration and said this is scare tactics, and that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are absolutely solid, and what you're doing, essentially he said, I'm paraphrasing, what you're doing is you would interfere with their ability to allow greater home ownership around the United States. So you're absolutely right. There was a push by the Congress to have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac go out and continue to go further and further and further and further. Look, everybody loves home ownership. I love home ownership. But if you're going to put people in homes that they can't afford, and seeing down the line that the taxpayers are going to have to bail this mess out, number one, and number two, that folks are going to lose their homes, what good is it? What have you done? So you're right on that. And cap and trade, I refer to as cap and tax. It would be one of the greatest impositions of the federal government on local decision making. And what we're seeing now is the administration, because they couldn't pass cap and trade in the Senate, has had the EPA make a decision that carbon is a polluting element, and therefore they have the right to impose cap and trade by executive order. This is a tremendous power grab that is ultimately going to affect each and every one of us, and I hope we can stop that. All right, let's see. I guess someone's coming back. Ma'am.
Thank you for being here today and having this opportunity. My question relates to healthcare. You stated agreement with the majority that our healthcare system has problems. I agree, and the World Health Organization is ranking the U.S. 37 in quality of healthcare, but the highest in cost at about 15% of our GDP in any other country. That means that we are paying a lot more to get a lot less, as evidenced by our receipt of Blue Cross Anthem raising our rates by 39%. That just happened recently. There's evidence that proves there are 4 different healthcare models operating well at less cost in other democracy countries. The Bismarck, the Frederick, the National Health Insurance, and out-of-pocket models. Currently, the U.S. uses fragments from all of these models, resulting in kind of a disorganized, expensive healthcare. My question to you is, which model do you support and why in order to keep our healthcare costs down?
Well, first of all, I think we had this conversation before about the WHO. You have to look at the way they count certain things. Our country counts as infant mortality, even when we attempt to try and save the baby that's at 22 weeks gestation period. Some other countries don't even count that as birth. Some countries don't even count a child who dies within a day or two as infant mortality. We have, in some ways, assumptions contained in their evaluation with respect to coverage, accessibility, etc., with a bias towards some systems that are not the U.S. system, and that results in us being at a lower level. Third, it is interesting that some say the Canadian system is superior to ours, when we just had the equivalent of a governor of one of the provinces of Canada who had to have heart surgery, and instead of going to Canada, he came down to the United States, even though his press people tried to keep that quiet. We have at least 41,000 Canadians who come to the United States every year for health care. Very few Americans go to Canada. So there are some very good parts of our system. What I would like to do is work on the strengths of our system and try and have an effective American system. I don't want a Swiss system, a French system, an English system. I want an American system that works. And one of the ways I think we can make it work better is by increasing competition. And so I would allow health care to be purchased across state lines. Number one. Number two, there are those who say, well, we have an antitrust exemption for health care insurance policy. In fact, we're going to vote on this next week. I would support a removal of that health care insurance antitrust exemption if they would adopt my amendment, which was adopted in Judiciary Committee when we passed our Judiciary Committee, which would allow insurance carriers to share historical data. And that allows them to gather information based on past history to help them create their tables to figure out what kind of risks are out there. The raw bill that's being presented wouldn't allow them to do that because they would say that would be colluded. I don't think sharing information, a historical model, will do that. And as a matter of fact, if we don't allow that sharing, some of the smaller insurance companies would probably go out of work, go out of business. So the question this week, next week when we go back, is will we allow my amendment to come up? When we passed the bill out of committee, we had some bipartisan support. I and two other Republicans on the committee voted for it with that amendment. As of last week, they would not tell us whether that was the version that was coming to the floor, and if it came to the floor, whether I would be given the opportunity to offer my amendment. If they don't allow me the opportunity to offer my amendment, what they're doing is they're doing nothing more than playing games. Because we worked on it in Judiciary. I went against conventional wisdom to support the elimination of the antitrust exemption for healthcare insurance providers. And but I did it only based on the fact that the insurers would have the information they truly need. If they won't allow us to do that, what they're going to do is try and make a political statement that Republicans don't support removing the antitrust exemption for healthcare insurance companies. I happen to think if you're for allowing across state line purchases of healthcare, you ought to also eliminate the antitrust exemption so long as they have the data that they can use to make rational decisions about their pricing. Secondly, what I would attempt to do is allow small businesses to organize in health associations so that they would have greater bargaining power. The third thing I would do is allow one of two options, or maybe a combination, and that is to build on what's already in the law, which is the federal government giving financial incentives to the states to create high-risk pools. Now, you can do that and have separate high-risk pools, or what you can do is have a fund which is shared by all of the insurance carriers so that essentially they do not deny people who have pre-existing conditions, and then that individual would have a number of options to choose from as opposed to just a single high-risk pool. So there's at least two ways to deal with that. So those are some of the things that I would do. Build on what we have in the United States, looking at various options that have worked here. Utah has a model that some people think might be able to go nationwide. So I'd like to look at a number of U.S. state models as opposed to foreign models. And I'm trying to find out how this is. Oh, this was over about 5 minutes ago. So let me just take a couple more questions here. Yes, sir, way in the back.
First of all, I say appreciate that you're here with us, Congressman. Second of all, thank you for declaring that you are in favor of eliminating some taxes right now for small businesses. That's really important for our economy. We're in a local sheriff's race here in the county, and one of the questions that's been on my mind as far as national issues go is a little bit different than anything I've heard here today, but I just want to ask you a question to see if it's on the radar. I'm sure that it is, and I hope you can give some light to this. You know, the president established last year that he was in favor as part of, underneath the guise of national security, he would like to develop a national police force. In my opinion, that would usurp the power of our local policing and sheriff authorities, and I am definitely not in favor of that. And I don't know why he would say something like that, but that's a really scary thought, that you could try to get something like that through the guise of national security to have a national police force, so that somebody sitting at a computer in D.C. can micromanage our justice system here in Calgary County.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what comment you're referring to. If you're talking about, I mean, because I certainly don't support it, and I haven't seen an explicit statement on that. If you're talking about multi-jurisdictional task forces involving the federal, state, and local law enforcement, I think they work well, and as Attorney General, we managed about, I don't know, maybe 27 of those around the state in an anti-drug effort. There are some people who fear that under the Patriot Act, he's given too many powers to law enforcement. I don't agree with that. I'm on the committee that oversees it and attempt to oversee that on a regular basis. I have not seen an argument for that. Now, the president has supported what he calls the COPS program, which is the federal government directly funding local law enforcement. That was a program that started under the Clinton administration as a 4-year program. It was supposed to be seat money for local jurisdictions to hire police officers, where the federal government would pay 100% the first year, 75% the second year, 50% the third year, 25% the fourth year, and thereafter local governments were on their own. Some people have seen this as a perpetual program. But we've had a long tradition in the United States not to have a national police force. The FBI is not a national police force. And I used to bristle when I was Attorney General whenever I hear people say, well, the FBI is coming in, therefore it must be important. I love the FBI, they do a good job in many circumstances, but local law enforcement does 98% of the policing in America, and I hope it'll always stay that way. One more question and then we're done. Yes, sir.
I'm actually inspired on the other side. My question is nothing even upsetting. One of the things the president has said is going to freeze discretionary spending for 3 years and not match the military entitlement programs. But the thing is, if we keep borrowing money and getting tax breaks and lowering taxes, we have to borrow more and more money. What about the financial stuff like that? You know, it's technically up from debt. It's easy to get here. But at some point, we have to seriously think what's about it. I think that kind of like.
Yeah, I believe that the essence of the question is, what about us? Well, the president indicated that he wanted to have a freeze on non-discretionary, or excuse me, non-defense, non-national security, discretionary spending, which therefore would not include the military nor homeland security. And shouldn't we look at those as well? I believe that's the question. And tackle Social Security and so forth. I have to look at what the fundamentals of the government are, what the fundamental obligations are. I think the first obligation of the federal government is to defend us. Therefore, I look at the defense budget as to whether or not it matches the threat that's out there. That's how I look at it. I make exceptions for that compared to others because I think it is number one responsibility. Does that mean we should have waste in the federal government? No. I have for 30 years worked on something that allows the federal government and individuals to go after war profiteers or people who have committed fraud against the federal government. It was originally called Lincoln's Law because it was passed when Abraham Lincoln was president, signed by him, to go after people who supplied the Union Army with lame horses, bad food, all that sort of stuff. And so we created a system where an individual can go after them, and that individual, if he brings that to the attention of the government and they are successful, the individual actually gets a percentage of the returns. It's to allow incentives for people to show the fraud is taking place. That existed in the law until World War II, and then in the middle of World War II, I think it was the Secretary of War at the time, believed that it was too onerous on the military industrial complex. And so they made changes in the law which neutered it. Then in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, and I was on the Judiciary Committee, I worked with Democrats there to resurrect that bill and change the law so that we could go after the people who were defrauding the federal government in the Defense Department, but it also goes to other departments. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court made some decisions about 3 years ago in which they said the way the law was written, you could go after direct contractors, but if you were a subcontractor cheating the government, this law would not apply. So I co-sponsored legislation to change that so we can go after subcontractors as well. So I am always trying to make sure that there were incentives for people to look out for fraud in areas, but particularly in the area of defense. And I will stand on that as long as I'm in the Congress. Look, if you want to look at somewhat controversial, but probably the best, most comprehensive look at what we have to do to get ourselves back into fiscal sanity. Congressman Ryan from Wisconsin, Paul Ryan from Wisconsin, he's the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, has a website, I believe it's called AmericaRoadmap.com, where he has laid out an overall comprehensive proposal for dealing with entitlements, dealing with overall spending, dealing with the tax code, dealing with fiscal policy, dealing with monetary policy. Now the problem is, as soon as he puts it out there, it becomes a target, because there's something in there for everybody to dislike. But the overall approach is to say, if we took all these things together, we would put ourselves on a glide path towards balanced budgets. We'd be able to save Medicare, we'd be able to save Social Security. And one of the things is, he protects anybody who's already in those programs, all right? And if you're 55 or older, about to enter those programs, you're no changes. But it does make changes if you're younger than that. But it gives you notice as to what those changes are going to be. And it creates a reality that will allow those programs to continue to exist. And so I would beg you to take a look at it. If you watch the meeting we had with the president, Paul Ryan was the one who had the interchange with the president several times. The president said, hey, you got some good ideas. I don't like all your ideas. That was kind of interesting because he said you got some good ideas. 2 days later, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the Democratic National League went after Paul Ryan with a vengeance by pointing out, oh my God, he wants to do this to Medicare, he wants to do this to Social Security, leaving out the fact that he protects everybody who's already in it, everybody who's about to be in it, but then tries to save the program. That's the kind of courageous decisions we're going to have to make. And we got to get away from this. I'm going to take a pot shot at you if you raise your head, out of the foxhole to say, hey, let's have some sanity here. So I would just say, Paul Ryan, one of the brightest guys we got in the Congress, well respected on both sides of the aisle. I believe it's called AmericaRoadmap.com. You look at it. He would like to have your comments. I'd like to have your comments on it because we're going to have to come together, men and women, in this country and solve this problem. Because my little granddaughter was just born yesterday. She won't be able to take that debt. And we are not doing the job that we should be doing if we don't begin addressing those problems today, not tomorrow, not next year, not next decade. Thank you very, very much.